It was supposed to be an exchange of ideas, the kind of back and forth that democracy thrives on. The cameras panned across the studio, lights blazing, every seat filled with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett had just begun to shape her point, her tone measured, her words deliberate, her presence commanding not because she shouted, but because she spoke with clarity. But before her thought could breathe, before her sentence could finish, Sarah Palin lunged in. Her voice cut through the air like a jagged blade, loud, forceful, interrupting. "Now hold on just a second." Palin barked, her words ricocheting through the microphones, drawing startled gasps from the crowd. It wasn't just an interruption. It was a challenge, an attempt to seize the stage, to drown out reason with sheer volume. Crockett paused, her expression unshaken, though the sharpness of Palin's intrusion hung heavy in the air. The audience shifted, some leaning forward with curiosity, others shaking their heads at the brashness on display. The studio's tension was palpable. This was no ordinary debate. This was a collision of two worlds. Palin thrived on spectacle, on the roar of her own voice. Crockett embodied something different, a steadiness that made arrogance look small. The moderator tried to cut in, but Palin barreled forward, her words layering over themselves like crashing waves. She was relentless, intent on breaking the rhythm of her opponent, intent on reminding everyone that volume could masquerade as dominance. And then, the camera caught it. Crockett simply waited. She didn't flinch. She didn't stumble. She let Palin's storm rage for a moment longer, eyes fixed, posture steady. It was in that stillness, in that refusal to be rattled, that the crowd began to sense something extraordinary was about to happen. The clash wasn't just about policy or partisanship. It was about style, dignity, and respect. Palin interrupted to diminish, but in her calm silence, Crockett was already rising. Above and then, just as Palin's voice thundered across the studio, Jasmine Crockett did the unthinkable. The words she spoke next would not only slice through the noise, but also leave the room suspended, in stunned silence. But the silence that followed would change everything. The interruption wasn't just rudeness, it was a test of whether composure could withstand chaos, whether reason could endure against raw noise. And the stakes stretched far beyond the walls of that glittering studio. Every person watching at home, every voter scrolling through clips, every young immigrant child seeing themselves reflected in Jasmine Crockett's calm eyes, they were all about to decide which kind of leadership they believed America deserved. Sarah Palin had built her brand on cutting in, on drowning out nuance with bravado. To her supporters, interruptions weren't breaches of etiquette. They were proof of strength. Every loud interjection, every raised voice, every finger jab was meant to project dominance. She wasn't speaking just to Crockett. She was performing for the millions who still clung to her as a symbol of defiant disruption. But Crockett represented something more fragile and far more powerful. She carried herself as though the moment belonged not to ego but to truth. She knew her audience too, young progressives hungry for leaders who wouldn't just shout louder, but would stand taller. For them, every second she held her ground wasn't silence, it was resistance, dignity, and motion. That's what made this clash electric. This wasn't an argument about a single issue. It was about what America rewards, the spectacle of interruption or the courage of patience. And in that studio, as millions tuned in, the contrast sharpened like a blade. Every glare from Palin, every rushed-over word, was a reminder of the old playbook. Louder is stronger. But every measured breath Crockett took in return challenged that idea. She wasn't going to fight on Palin's terms. She wasn't going to rush. And that was unsettling. The audience could feel the air thickening. This wasn't a trivial squabble. It was theater with the nation as its audience. The moderator shuffled papers nervously. Producers in the control room whispered about clipping the exchange for headlines. Commentators on Twitter began hammering their keyboards. Here we go again. Palin interrupts another woman mid-sentence. But something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just about an interruption. It was about identity, respect, and the right to be heard. Crockett wasn't simply a politician answering a question. She was a black woman in America, refusing to let her voice be erased. She was standing as proof that calm could be louder than shouting, that composure could eclipse chaos, and yet the true twist hadn't arrived. Because what Crockett was preparing to say next, the way she would reframe Palin's outburst, wasn't just going to win the moment. It was going to set off a chain reaction far outside that studio's walls. The gasps, the tweets, the headlines, they were still to come. What happens next isn't just another exchange of words. It's the pivot point, where a single reply becomes a symbol. And what Crockett did in that instant would change everything. Sarah Palin didn't arrive in that studio as an unknown. She walked in carrying a reputation forged over years of spectacle and soundbites. A political identity built less on careful reasoning and more on a kind of loud, brash charisma that commanded attention whether people agreed with her or not. To her base, that was the appeal. She wasn't polished, she wasn't quiet, and she certainly wasn't going to let someone else finish a sentence if she thought she could bulldoze her way through it first. Her rise had always been rooted in disruption. From her earliest days on the national stage, Palin perfected the art of speaking in fragments that sounded simple, punchy, almost folksy. She'd toss out a quip, an insult, or a slogan, and the crowd would roar. But behind that facade of relatability was a deeper strategy, volume as dominance. If she kept talking long enough, if she projected certainty loudly enough, the details didn't matter. What mattered was the show, and America had seen it time and again. Interviews where she dodged questions but drowned the moment in personality. Rally speeches where she lit up crowds, not with policy but with punchlines. TV appearances where she'd lean in, cut off her opponent, and grin as though winning the microphone meant winning the debate. For years this method worked, because spectacle sells and Palin knew how to sell it. But her pattern wasn't just about performance. It revealed something sharper, a refusal to let others, especially women who represented a new, more inclusive vision of politics, own their space. Palin's interruptions weren't random. They were power plays, a way of saying, I'm still here, I'm still louder, I'm still in charge. To many, that arrogance became a kind of signature move, and yet the cracks were always there. With every headline that painted her as brash instead of brilliant, with every viral clip that showed her talking over instead of engaging with, Palin's approach began to look less like strength and more like insecurity. She wasn't answering hard questions. She was dodging them with noise. She wasn't respecting the room. She was dominating it to hide the silence behind her own arguments. Still, she thrived on this image, and that's why she walked into the studio that night with such confidence. Interrupting Jasmine Crockett wasn't an accident. It was the playbook. It was muscle memory. Palin thought she could rattle her, that she could drag her into the mud of shouting matches, where Palin had always felt most at home. The audience saw it unfold the way they'd seen it before. The raised voice, the sharp cut-in, the insistence that her words take precedence. Some groaned, others cheered, but no one was surprised. It was Palin being Palin, the antagonist who fed on chaos. But here's the catch: Palin had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. She had squared off against polished politicians who tried to match her volume and failed, against commentators who stumbled when she hijacked the conversation, against moderators too timid to reel her in. But Crockett wasn't rattled. Crockett had been forged in environments where interruptions weren't new, they were constant. And that's where Palin miscalculated. Her pattern, the very thing that built her brand, was about to become the very thing that exposed her. Because in the contrast between Palin's storm and Crockett's stillness, viewers were beginning to notice a shift. The louder Palin grew, the smaller she looked. The calmer Crockett remained, the larger her presence became. The very weapon Palin had always used to dominate was turning into a mirror, reflecting not Crockett's weakness, but Palin's desperation. The history of Palin's outbursts wasn't just backdrop, it was fuel for the drama of this moment. Everyone watching had seen her do this before. But this time, they were about to see something different, because for the first time Palin's old playbook was about to fail her, and that failure would arrive in the form of Jasmine Crockett's reply. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot on that debate stage, she carried with her a story written in resilience. Her rise was not carved out of privilege or inherited power. It was built from the ground up, brick by brick, through the weight of hard work and the sting of being underestimated. That quiet strength, the kind Palin had no playbook against, had been forged long before the cameras turned her way. Crockett's childhood wasn't the type that drew headlines, but it shaped her in ways that mattered. Raised in a family that valued honesty, service, and education, she learned early on that life doesn't hand out respect. You earn it, and sometimes you fight for it. Growing up, she saw the cracks in the American promise, the inequities that others tried to ignore. She watched friends struggle for opportunities she believed every child deserved, and somewhere in those early years a fire was lit. She pursued education with a fierce determination. Law wasn't just a career choice, it was a calling. Crockett saw the courtroom as a battlefield where justice could actually mean something tangible, and while others might have been intimidated by the weight of the law, she leaned into it. She built a reputation as a defender of the voiceless, an advocate who wouldn't be bullied by louder, more powerful figures across the table. Her legal background gave her a precision with words that few could match. Where Palin relied on slogans, Crockett relied on facts. Where others panicked in the face of interruption, Crockett knew the power of measured silence. She had spent years in spaces where being talked over wasn't a rarity, it was a daily reality. And in those moments, she developed the composure that would one day stop a studio dead in its tracks. Her entry into politics wasn't about fame, it was about representation. Crockett saw herself as a vessel for the communities often left in the shadows, immigrants, working families, young people craving change. She wasn't flashy. She was focused. And slowly, steadily, she began to carve out a reputation not just as a fighter, but as someone who could rise above the chaos. In Congress, Crockett became known for her sharp questioning during hearings, her ability to cut through the noise and demand accountability. Viewers across the country began to notice the same pattern. She didn't need to shout to land a blow. She had the patience to let arrogance expose itself, and the skill to deliver words so precise they left no escape. And yet, she never lost the personal warmth that drew people in. To her supporters, she wasn't just a politician, she was proof. Proof that someone who looked like them, who carried their struggles, who embodied their pride, could walk into the lion's den and hold her ground. For immigrants, for young women of color, for anyone who had ever been dismissed or interrupted, Crockett was more than a leader. She was a mirror of possibility. That's what made this showdown with Palin feel like more than just political theater. It was history colliding with history. Palin represented the old way, loudness, spectacle, and entitlement masquerading as strength. Crockett represented the future, calm, composed, unshaken dignity that turned interruption into opportunity. As Palin barked and blustered, Crockett's backstory hummed beneath the surface. Every pause she held was a reminder of the courtroom silence she had once owned. Every calm glance was proof that she had faced storms bigger than a TV interruption. She wasn't new to chaos. She was trained by it. And while Palin thought she could rattle her, Crockett was already setting the stage for something much bigger. This wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about demonstrating to millions of viewers that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes strength is the refusal to be moved. That's why the audience leaned in. That's why social media started buzzing, even before the exchange reached its climax. People could sense the gravity of what was happening. They knew Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was carrying the weight of every voice that had ever been silenced, interrupted, or dismissed. Her story made her unshakable. And as Palin shouted over her words, Crockett's silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation, because Jasmine Crockett knew exactly what she was about to say. And when she finally spoke, the interruption that Palin thought would secure her dominance would instead become the very stage on which Crockett's calm power would eclipse everything else. And in that moment, as she drew a breath and prepared to respond, the air in the studio changed. The storm had raged. Now came the calm, and that calm would rewrite the entire narrative. The clash did not stop with that first interruption. If anything, it grew sharper with every passing second. Palin, emboldened by the noise she had already stirred, pressed harder. Each time Jasmine Crockett leaned toward the microphone, Palin's voice came crashing in like thunder. Boisterous, unrelenting, insistent. Wait, wait, wait. Let me finish here. Palin snapped, waving a hand as if Crockett were a guest in her own conversation. The audience stirred restlessly, murmurs spilling into the air. It wasn't just interruption anymore, it was spectacle. Crockett sat forward, poised but steady, her eyes never leaving Palin. She tried again to weave her argument, words measured, grounded in the truth she had prepared to share. But Palin cut across her once more, this time louder, leaning into the microphone as if sheer force could drown out substance. The moderator attempted to intervene, his voice cracking with a strained, "Ladies, let's allow Representative Crockett to—" only to be smothered by Palin's continued barrage. The room grew restless. Gasps, groans, even scattered applause from Palin's loyalists filled the studio. The moment teetered on chaos. But amid that clamor, Crockett's restraint became the story. She didn't slam her hand on the table. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't let the storm drag her down. Instead, she waited, watching Palin unravel with each desperate interruption, and that patience unsettled her opponent. For every second Crockett held her ground, Palin grew more animated, her voice pitching higher, her sentences tumbling faster. She jabbed her finger toward the audience, trying to pull them to her side, trying to manufacture dominance through volume. Yet the louder she became, the more the contrast sharpened. Crockett, calm as stone, Palin flailing in noise, social media lit up in real time. Viewers typed furiously, "Palin won't let her speak." Crockett's face says it all. This is painful to watch. Clips of the escalating exchange flooded timelines before the debate even ended, each replay amplifying the sense that Palin had lost control of her own stage. Inside the studio, the tension thickened. Every failed attempt by the moderator to restore order only magnified the imbalance. Every sigh from the crowd was a reminder that Palin's tactics were backfiring. And then, just for a moment, the noise peaked. Palin raised her voice to its highest pitch yet, a crescendo of interruption that bordered on shouting. It was meant to bury Crockett, to silence her completely. But instead it set the stage for what came next, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply being interrupted. She was gathering the weight of the room, letting Palin expend every ounce of noise, every fragment of her old playbook. Crockett was waiting for the precise moment when silence would fall. Not because Palin offered it, but because the storm of her interruptions would inevitably collapse under its own weight. And when that silence finally arrived, when Palin paused just long enough to catch her breath, the audience leaned forward in unison. Crockett opened her mouth to speak, and what she delivered next would not just answer Palin, it would redefine the moment entirely. The pause was brief, just a breath, just a sliver of quiet. But it was all Jasmine Crockett needed. She leaned forward, her hands folded calmly on the desk, her voice low, measured, and unwavering. "Are you finished?" she asked. The simplicity of the question landed like a hammer. The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the shift. Palin blinked, startled for the first time, caught between pushing forward and realizing she had handed her opponent the perfect opening. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable was deliberate, every word placed with the precision of a scalpel. "Because if you are," she continued, "I'd like to finish the point you were so determined to bury." The crowd erupted into applause, brief but fierce, a wave of validation that rolled across the studio. Palin opened her mouth to fire back, but something in the audience's energy froze her. For the first time that night she hesitated, and in that hesitation, Crockett struck. "You see," she said, turning slightly to address not Palin but the audience, the cameras, the millions watching at home. "Interruptions aren't arguments, volume isn't evidence, and noise isn't leadership." Each phrase carried a rhythm, a deliberate cadence that lifted the words into something larger than debate. It was no longer Crockett versus Palin, it was composure versus chaos, dignity versus arrogance. The audience leaned in, the studio lights catching every flicker of tension on Palin's face. Crockett pressed on, her tone never wavering. "Every time you cut me off, what you showed America wasn't strength. You showed fear. Fear that if my words were heard, they might matter more than yours. Fear that respect once given cannot be taken back by shouting over it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Palin shifted uncomfortably, her usual grin stiffening. Crockett had reframed the entire exchange in a matter of seconds, turning Palin's interruptions into evidence of weakness rather than dominance. "And let me be clear," Crockett added, her voice softening, almost intimate now. "I've been interrupted my whole life. As a woman, as a black woman, as someone who wasn't supposed to sit here in this seat at this table, with this microphone. But the truth is, I'm still here, and I will still be heard. The studio fell utterly silent. Not a murmur, not a cough, just silence. Even Palin, whose instinct was always to push, to jab, to jump in, sat frozen. For the first time, her interruptions had no place to land. Crockett allowed the silence to hang, stretching it just long enough to let the weight of her words settle. Then she delivered the line that detonated across the country. Because the difference between you and me is simple. You fight to be loud. I fight to be heard. The crowd exploded. Applause thundered through the studio, rising like a wave that drowned out Palin's muttered protest. People rose from their seats. The moderator's eyes widened, as if even he understood they had just witnessed a turning point. Palin scrambled to respond, her voice climbing again, but the damage was already done. Each attempt to claw back ground sounded shrill against Crockett's calm. The more Palin spoke, the smaller she appeared, and the more Crockett waited, composed, patient, the larger she grew in the room. Commentators backstage whispered into their earpieces, preparing to tell the world about the moment. Social media feeds lit up instantly, clips of Crockett's line flooding timelines. You fight to be loud. I fight to be heard. Hashtags sprang into life in seconds. Crockett mic drop. Heard not loud. Calm power. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, letting the audience settle, before delivering her closing thrust in the exchange. This country doesn't need another voice that talks over people. We've had enough of that. What we need is leadership that listens, leadership that respects, leadership that lifts others up instead of drowning them out. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's not me who shouldn't be speaking, it's you. The eruption that followed was deafening. Palin tried to interject, but the moment was gone. Crockett had taken control of the narrative, the stage, and the story. Even the cameras seemed to linger on Crockett longer now, framing her not as just another participant in a debate, but as the center of it. Palin's voice, once dominant, now sounded like background noise against the resonance of Crockett's calm authority. The moderator, sensing the shift, moved quickly to transition, but everyone knew the debate had already turned a corner. Palin's interruptions had backfired spectacularly. Crockett's reply had crystallized into something bigger than the argument at hand. It had become a statement of identity, of resilience, of dignity. In living rooms across America, families replayed the moment. Young women nodded in recognition. Children of immigrants smiled with pride. Communities that had long felt silenced saw themselves reflected in Crockett's composure. And Palin, once the disruptor-in-chief, was left diminished by the very tactic that had defined her. Back in the studio, Crockett sat silently, her point made, her presence unshaken. Palin shuffled her notes, eyes darting nervously, searching for footing she would never regain that night. And though the debate continued, the story had already been written, because when Jasmine Crockett chose calm over chaos, silence over shouting, dignity over disruption, she didn't just win the exchange. She created a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of that studio. And in that silence that followed, America realized it had just witnessed something unforgettable. But as the night went on, the shockwaves of that moment would travel further than anyone inside that studio could have imagined. The debate rolled on, but the air inside the studio was permanently altered. What had begun as a clash of voices had shifted into something else entirely, a living demonstration of control versus collapse. Palin, once the center of every exchange, now fumbled to find her footing. Each time she raised her voice, it echoed against the memory of Crockett's calm retort, like a singer trying to follow a symphony with static. The audience felt it too. Where Palin's interruptions had once drawn scattered cheers, now they drew sighs, even eye rolls. People leaned toward Crockett, waiting for her words with an anticipation that had not been present before. The power dynamic in the room had flipped, and everyone knew it. Backstage, producers whispered urgently into their headsets. One asked, "Do we cut to break early?" Another shook his head. "No, so this is the show now, don't interrupt this." Camera operators adjusted their frames, instinctively focusing longer on Crockett, letting Palin's interjections blur into the margins. The moderator, still rattled, tried to regain neutrality. "Let's move on to the next topic," he announced. But as he turned, his eyes betrayed the truth. Crockett had just seized the stage in a way debates rarely allow. Palin sensed it too, and desperation leaked through every movement. Her smile faltered, her words tumbled out faster, as though she could outrun the memory of that line. "You fight to be loud. I fight to be heard." But each attempt only magnified her unraveling. Crockett, by contrast, barely needed to speak now. Her silence spoke louder than Palin's noise. When she did choose to enter the conversation, it was with the same precision. As before, direct, unshaken, and rooted in something deeper than argument. Every word reinforced the moment that had already defined the night. The crowd responded in kind. Applause swelled more frequently, laughter broke out at Palin's expense, and murmurs of admiration followed Crockett. It was no longer just a debate. It was a turning point captured live, unfolding like a story scripted for history. Up in the control booth, a producer muttered, "This clip is going to run on every highlight reel by morning." Another replied, "By morning, it's already viral." And they weren't wrong. Social media feeds glowed with Crockett's words, replayed, remixed, subtitled, and celebrated. Memes sprouted in real time. Her calm face opposite Palin's shouting became a split-screen symbol of two Americas, one clinging to noise, the other embodying resilience. Inside the studio, Palin grew visibly agitated by the shifting energy. At one point she leaned across the desk, jabbing a finger toward Crockett, her voice trembling with frustration. "You don't get to lecture me about leadership," she barked. But Crockett didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, eyes steady, as though watching a storm exhaust itself. The audience groaned audibly. Some even booed. Palin's tactic had collapsed entirely. The louder she became, the smaller she appeared. The moderator, desperate to cool the flames, tried to interject with statistics, but nobody was listening. Not really. The studio had chosen its hero and its villain, and every exchange only deepened the divide. Crockett finally spoke again, softly, almost like a closing argument. "If leadership means silencing others, then maybe we need to ask what you're so afraid of hearing." The studio erupted. Palin's lips parted, but no words came. The applause thundered louder than anything she could have said. It wasn't just support, it was vindication. And in that moment, something crystallized. The story was no longer about two women sparring on a stage. It was about what their clash represented. The end of an old script and the beginning of a new one. Palin's interruptions had been the last breath of a performance America had grown weary of. Crockett's composure was the first glimpse of something different, something stronger, something that belonged to the future. As the segment closed, cameras zoomed in one last time. Palin's face was tight, her eyes darting nervously. Crockett sat, calm, steady, resolute. The split-screen image told the story better than any headline could, and though the debate continued, the world outside the studio was already reacting. Phones buzzed with notifications. Clips circulated like wildfire. Commentators began drafting their takes. History was already in motion, but no one in the studio would ever forget the silence that followed Crockett's words or the roar that came after. Because in that fallout, one truth was undeniable. Sarah Palin had tried to own the room with noise. Jasmine Crockett had claimed it with presence, and the echo of that reversal was only just beginning to spread. When the cameras cut away from the studio and the dust of confrontation began to settle, something lingered in the air, something larger than Palin's shouting or Crockett's restraint. It was the unmistakable sense that a lesson had been carved into the moment, a lesson about the kind of leadership America craves and the kind it must leave behind. For years, Palin had thrived on spectacle, on being the loudest voice in the room, the spark that ignited division. But what Jasmine Crockett revealed was that spectacle has an expiration date. There comes a time when theatrics cannot disguise the absence of substance. There comes a moment when a voice raised in anger collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. And Crockett, with her calm, unshaken delivery, embodied that turning point. She showed that dignity is not passive. It is not weakness. It is not silence. Dignity is power precisely because it cannot be stolen by noise. It is the refusal to be reduced to someone else's shouting match. As commentators scrambled to define the exchange, one theme kept rising. Crockett's composure had done more than win a debate. It had reminded viewers of a universal truth: that true leadership is not measured by volume, but by vision, not by interruption, but by integrity. Not by dominance, but by the courage to let your words stand on their own. Social media erupted with posts framing Crockett's reply as a rallying cry. This is how you fight back, with grace, not chaos. She didn't just answer Palin, she answered every person who's ever been told to shut up and stay in their place. Now, people who had never before tuned in to a political debate shared clips of her line, sending it across borders and time zones. But beyond the memes and the hashtags, there was something deeply personal in the way her words landed. Immigrants saw themselves in her resilience. Women saw themselves in her restraint. Anyone who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or interrupted found validation in the quiet storm of her reply, and therein lay the moral clarity of the night. Noise fades, but truth endures. Palin had wielded her interruptions like weapons, but they disintegrated in real time, leaving nothing but echoes. Crockett wielded patience, precision, and presence, and those became immortalized. This was not just a victory in a televised debate. It was a reminder of what America must aspire to be: a country where voices are not silenced by arrogance, a country where calm is not mistaken for weakness, a country where dignity outshines hate. And as the cameras faded to black, as audiences carried the moment with them into their living rooms, their feeds, their conversations, one thing became undeniable. Crockett had not only won the exchange, she had set a new standard. Because in the end, it wasn't just Sarah Palin who was left in silence. It was every tactic of interruption, every attempt to dominate by sheer noise, every old script that no longer speaks to the America rising now. And for those who witnessed it, the lesson was unforgettable. The loudest voice is not always the strongest. Sometimes the calmest one changes everything. And so, as the lights dimmed and the debate slipped into history, one image lingered: Sarah Palin, silenced by her own noise, and Jasmine Crockett, standing firm in the quiet strength of her truth. It was more than a moment. It was a mirror held up to America. Which path will we follow? The path of arrogance and interruption, or the path of dignity and resolve? For many watching, the answer was already clear. Crockett's composure wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. It belonged to everyone who has ever been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated. It belonged to everyone who believes that leadership is not a volume contest, but a test of character. And that's why this story matters beyond a single studio, beyond a single debate stage. Because it challenges us to rethink what kind of voices we amplify, what kind of strength we admire, and what kind of America we want to build together. If you felt that moment resonate, if you saw yourself in Crockett's reply, if you felt the power of dignity rising above chaos, then this is your movement too. Share this story. Pass it forward. Because every time it's retold, it chips away at the old script of noise and makes space for a new one. A script where calm, steady voices cannot be drowned out. This isn't just commentary. This is a call to remember, to resist, to rise. Because the silence that followed Crockett's words wasn't emptiness, it was transformation. And now, it's your turn to carry it forward. Subscribe, share, stand with the voices that refuse to be silenced. Together, let's make sure the echo of this moment never fades.